In a forgotten hangar in Hartwell, South Dakota, sat a 1947 experimental aircraft. This plane would become the bridge between a struggling single father's desperation and a billionaire's 30-year search for closure. Joseph Clark had no idea that the mysterious plane he discovered would connect him to Helen Mansfield. She's one of America's wealthiest women, whose aviator husband had vanished decades ago along with his revolutionary aircraft. As Joseph and his twins, Violet and Blake, began restoring the forgotten machine in their small workshop, they unknowingly set in motion events that would attract the attention of ruthless developers. These events would test the limits of their community support and ultimately lead to an offer that would transform not just their family's future, but the entire landscape of aviation restoration in America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the gaps in the metal siding of Hartwell Aviation Services like a knife through paper. Joseph Clark hunched deeper into his worn work jacket as he bent over the engine of a Cessna 172. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, despite the cold that had settled into his bones. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered workshop floor. Tools lay scattered among oil-stained rags and coffee cups that had long since grown cold. Outside, the South Dakota prairie stretched endlessly under a gray sky that promised snow before morning. The wind howled across the flat expanse, rattling the windows of the small aviation repair shop. This shop had been Joseph's livelihood for the past 8 years, since losing his job at the regional aircraft maintenance facility. This modest operation had been all that stood between his family and financial ruin. Joseph wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back from the Cessna's engine compartment. He studied the complex maze of wires and components with the eye of someone who had spent most of his adult life understanding how things flew. At 42, his dark hair was already showing streaks of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many late nights spent working under these same flickering lights. The shop itself reflected years of careful maintenance on a shoestring budget. Every tool had its place. Every part was cataloged and stored with military precision. Joseph had learned organization from his father, who had served as an aircraft engineer during World War II. The old man's influence was everywhere in the shop, from the vintage aviation posters on the walls to the meticulous record-keeping system that tracked every repair, every part, every hour of labor. The front door chimed as someone entered, bringing with them a gust of cold air that made Joseph shiver. Richard Morrison appeared in the doorway between the front office and the workshop. His tall frame filled the space as he surveyed the controlled chaos of the repair bay. At 65, Richard had the bearing of a man who had spent decades around aircraft, first as a pilot in the Air Force and later as the manager of Hartwell Regional Airport. "Working late again, Joe," Richard said, his voice carrying the warm concern of an old friend. Joseph looked up from the engine, managing a tired smile. "This old bird needs to be airworthy by tomorrow morning. The owner's flying to Denver for his daughter's wedding." Richard nodded, understanding the pressures that came with running a small aviation business. He had watched Joseph struggle to keep the shop afloat after his wife Grace had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise 14-year-old twins while trying to maintain a business that barely broke, even in the best of times. "How are Violet and Blake doing?" Richard asked, settling onto a worn stool near the workbench. "They're good kids," Joseph replied, returning his attention to the engine. "Violet's been spending more time out here asking questions about how everything works. She's got good hands for this kind of work. Blake's more interested in the business side of things. He keeps telling me we need better marketing." Richard chuckled. "Smart kids. They get that from their father." Joseph's expression darkened slightly as he continued working. "Smart kids deserve better than watching their father barely scrape by month after month." "Shop's bleeding money, Richard. I'm 3 months behind on the lease, and Anthony Harrington's been sniffing around again." The mention of Anthony Harrington's name brought a scowl to Richard's weathered face. The real estate developer had been systematically buying up properties around the airport, promising to bring prosperity to Hartwell through commercial development. In reality, his plans would transform the small agricultural community into another generic strip mall destination, destroying the character that had defined the town for generations. "Harrington's a vulture," Richard said with obvious distaste. "He's been pressuring half the businesses in town to sell, offering just enough money to make desperate people think twice about holding on to their dreams." Joseph set down his wrench and leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. "The kids don't know how bad things really are. I've been shielding them from the worst of it. But I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The bank's threatening to foreclose on the house, and without this shop, I don't know what I'll do for work." Richard studied his friend's face, seeing the weight of responsibility that pressed down on Joseph's shoulders like a physical burden. "You know, there might be something that could help. I've been meaning to talk to you about it for weeks now." Joseph raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued despite his exhaustion. "What kind of something?" Richard stood and walked to the window that overlooked the airport grounds, his gaze settling on a cluster of old hangars that sat at the far end of the property. Most had been abandoned for years, their corrugated metal sides streaked with rust and their windows broken or boarded up. "You remember Hangar 5, the one at the end of the old military section?" Richard asked. Joseph nodded. Hartwell Regional had been built on the site of a former military training facility that had been active during the Korean War. When the military pulled out in the early 1960s, the town had converted the airfield for civilian use, but several of the original hangars had been left to deteriorate. "I was doing inventory on the old hangars last week, checking to see what condition they're in," Richard continued. "Most of them are empty, just dust and bird nests, but Hangar 5 had something interesting locked away in the back corner." Richard's voice took on a quality that made Joseph look up from his work. There was excitement there, barely contained beneath the older man's typically reserved demeanor. "What kind of interesting?" Joseph asked. "An aircraft covered with tarps. It's probably been sitting there for 30 years or more." "I only got a quick look at it, but from what I could see, it's something special. Old, but not like the usual Pipers and Cessnas we see around here. This looked custom-built, experimental, maybe." Joseph felt a spark of curiosity ignite in his chest, the first genuine interest he had felt in weeks. Experimental aircraft from the 50s and 60s could be worth serious money if they're in decent condition. Some collectors pay 6 figures for the right plane. "That's what I was thinking," Richard said, turning back from the window. "The hangar's been sealed up tight, so whatever's in there has been protected from the weather. If you could get it running again, restore it properly, it might be exactly the kind of project that could turn your finances around." Joseph wiped his hands more thoroughly, his mind already racing with possibilities. He had always been drawn to restoration work, finding satisfaction in taking something broken and making it whole again. It was what had attracted him to aviation in the first place, the idea that with enough skill and patience, almost anything could be made to fly again. "Who owns the hangar?" he asked. "Technically, the airport authority does, but it's been abandoned so long that nobody really pays attention to it. The aircraft inside is probably considered abandoned property at this point. If you could restore it and establish ownership through the proper legal channels, it could be yours." Joseph felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. "When can we take a look at it?" Richard grinned, recognizing the spark of determination that had returned to his friend's eyes. "How about right now? I've got the keys, and the kids are probably doing homework. We could drive over there and see what we're dealing with." Joseph glanced around the workshop, calculating how much more work the Cessna needed. The engine was nearly finished, and the few remaining tasks could wait until morning. "Let me lock up here and we'll go take a look." 20 minutes later, Joseph found himself following Richard's pickup truck across the darker section of the airport grounds. Their headlights cut through the gathering dusk as they approached the row of abandoned hangars. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter's first serious storm. Hangar 5 loomed ahead of them, its massive doors secured with a heavy chain and padlock that looked like it had been there for decades. Richard parked near the smaller side entrance and climbed out of his truck, flashlight in hand and keys jingling in the cold air. "Haven't been inside here in probably 15 years, Richard said as he worked the old, lock. "Used to use these hangars for equipment storage, but we moved everything closer to the main terminal when the new maintenance facility was built." The lock finally gave way with a rusty click, and Richard pushed open the heavy door. Stale air rushed out, carrying the musty smell of decades of dust and neglect. Joseph followed Richard inside, his own flashlight beam joining with his friends to illuminate the cavernous interior of the hangar. The space was larger than Joseph had expected, with a high ceiling supported by steel trusses and concrete floors that were cracked, but still solid. Along the walls, he could see the remnants of old workbenches and tool cabinets, evidence that this hangar had once been an active maintenance facility. But it was the shape in the back corner that captured Joseph's attention. Even covered by multiple layers of tarp and canvas, the outline was unmistakably that of an aircraft. The covering had been secured carefully, suggesting that whoever had stored the plane here had intended to return for it someday. "There she is," Richard said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Been sitting there like a sleeping giant for longer than I can remember." Joseph approached the covered aircraft slowly, his flashlight beam playing across the dusty canvas. The plane was smaller than a commercial aircraft, but larger than the typical general aviation planes he worked on regularly. As he moved around it, he could make out the distinctive shape of what appeared to be a single-engine design with sleek, streamlined lines that suggested it had been built for performance rather than utility. "Help me pull these covers off," Joseph said, his excitement growing despite his efforts to remain practical. Working together, the two men began removing the layers of protection that had kept the aircraft hidden for so many years. Dust rose in clouds as they pulled away the canvas, making them both cough and squint in the flashlight beams. When the last tarp fell away, Joseph stood in stunned silence, his flashlight beam revealing an aircraft unlike anything he had ever seen in person. The plane was beautiful, with clean lines and proportions that spoke of careful engineering and artistic design. The aluminum skin showed signs of age, but appeared to be in remarkably good condition, free of the corrosion that typically plagued aircraft left in storage for decades. "My God," Joseph whispered, moving closer to examine the cockpit. "This isn't just any experimental aircraft. Look at these design elements, the way the wings are integrated with the fuselage. This looks like it was built by someone who really knew what they were doing." Richard joined him at the nose of the aircraft, running his flashlight beam along the engine cowling. "No manufacturer's markings that I can see. Whoever built this kept it quiet." Joseph climbed onto a nearby workbench to get a better look at the upper surfaces of the wings. The construction was immaculate, with flush riveting and attention to detail that rivaled anything he had seen from major aircraft manufacturers. This was clearly the work of a master craftsman, someone who had poured their heart and soul into creating something extraordinary. "Richard," Joseph said, his voice filled with awe, "I think we might have found something really special here." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The aroma of bacon and eggs filled the small kitchen of the Clark household as Joseph stood at the stove, spatula in hand, his mind still reeling from the previous night's discovery. Weak November sunlight filtered through gingham curtains that Grace had hung 5 years ago, illuminating a kitchen that bore the comfortable clutter of a family making do with what they had. Dishes were stacked neatly in a rack beside the sink, and school papers covered one corner of the round oak table that served as both dining room and homework station. Violet appeared in the doorway, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had probably belonged to Blake the year before. At 14, she possessed an unconscious grace that reminded Joseph painfully of her mother, but her hands already bore the small scars and calluses of someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. "Dad, you're burning the eggs," she said, moving to rescue breakfast before it became inedible. Joseph blinked and refocused on the pan, quickly sliding the eggs onto plates. "Sorry, honey. My mind was elsewhere." Blake stumbled into the kitchen moments later, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his shirt wrinkled from sleep. Where Violet moved with purpose, Blake approached the morning like a negotiation that hadn't yet been won. He collapsed into his usual chair at the table and reached for the orange juice without opening his eyes fully. "You look like you didn't sleep much," Violet observed, studying her father's face as he set plates before them. Joseph poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 5 a.m. "Richard and I found something interesting at the airport last night, an old aircraft that's been stored in one of the abandoned hangars." Blake's eyes opened wider, suddenly alert. "What kind of aircraft? Is it worth anything?" "That's what we need to find out," Joseph said, settling into his chair with his coffee. "It's experimental. Probably from the late 40s. Beautiful craftsmanship. But I need to do some research to understand what we're dealing with." Violet leaned forward, her breakfast forgotten. "Can we see it? I mean, if it's just sitting there abandoned, maybe we could help you work on it." Joseph studied his daughter's eager expression, seeing the spark of curiosity that had been growing stronger each time she visited him at the shop. "It would be a big project, Violet. Restoration work takes months, sometimes years. And right now, I'm not even sure I can afford to keep the shop open." The excitement in both teenagers' faces dimmed slightly at the reminder of their family's financial situation. Joseph immediately regretted his words, wishing he could shield them from the adult worries that seemed to intrude on every conversation lately. "What if the plane really is valuable?" Blake asked, his business-minded nature already working through possibilities. "Like valuable enough to help us keep the shop." "That's the hope," Joseph admitted. "But first, I need to understand what it is and who might have built it. The construction is too sophisticated for a backyard builder. This was made by someone with serious engineering knowledge." Violet pushed eggs around her plate, deep in thought. "Could we help with the research? I mean, Blake's really good at finding information online, and I could help with the mechanical assessment." Joseph felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same pride he felt whenever his children showed their determination to tackle problems head-on. Grace had been the same way, never backing down from a challenge, never accepting defeat as final. "Tell you what," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze Violet's hand. "After school today, we'll drive over to the hangar and take a proper look. Then we can decide together whether this is something we want to pursue." The school day seemed to drag endlessly for both twins, their thoughts repeatedly returning to the mysterious aircraft waiting in Hangar 5. Violet found herself doodling airplane sketches in the margins of her history notes, while Blake spent his lunch period in the computer lab researching experimental aircraft from the 1940s. Hartwell High School, a brick building that had served the community since the 1960s, housed the Clark twins, good students who kept to themselves. They participated in enough activities to avoid being labeled antisocial, but their friends understood that they had responsibilities at home that other kids didn't share. Sophia Martinez, their favorite teacher, noticed their distraction during her afternoon English class. A young woman in her late 20s who had returned to her hometown after college to give back to the community, Sophia had developed a special fondness for the Clark twins. She understood the challenges of growing up in a single-parent household and made extra effort to provide encouragement and support. "Earth to Violet," Sophia said gently, as the class discussed themes in their current novel. "You seem a million miles away today." Violet blushed and straightened in her seat. "Sorry, Miss Martinez. Dad found something interesting at the airport, and I guess I'm excited to see it." "Oh, what kind of something?" "An old airplane that's been stored for decades. Dad thinks it might be valuable if we can restore it." Sophia's expression brightened with genuine interest. "That sounds like an amazing project. Your father's really talented with mechanical work." The conversation was interrupted by the final bell, and students began gathering their books and bags. As Violet and Blake prepared to leave, Sophia called them over to her desk. "I don't know if this helps," she said, pulling a business card from her desk drawer, "but my cousin works at the State Historical Society in Pierre. If you need help researching the aircraft's background, she might be able to point you in the right direction." Blake took the card gratefully. "Thanks, Miss Martinez. That could be really useful." An hour later, the Clark family stood before Hangar 5 as Joseph worked the rusty lock that Richard had secured the night before. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete apron, and a cold wind whistled through the gaps in the hangar's metal siding. When the door swung open, both teenagers stepped inside with the reverence of people entering a cathedral. The aircraft sat in the filtered afternoon light, its aluminum skin gleaming despite the dust and neglect. In daylight, the plane's elegant lines were even more apparent, and both Violet and Blake stood speechless for several moments. "Wow," Violet whispered finally. "Dad, this is incredible." Blake circled the aircraft slowly, his business instincts already calculating possibilities. "How much would something like this be worth if it were restored?" "That depends on what it is and who built it," Joseph replied, opening a large toolbox he had brought from the shop. "First, we need to do a thorough inspection and see what we're working with." For the next 2 hours, the family systematically examined every visible inch of the aircraft. Joseph checked the engine compartment, finding a custom-built power plant that showed signs of sophisticated engineering. Violet crawled under the fuselage with a flashlight, calling out observations about the landing gear and control systems. Blake documented everything with his phone, taking detailed photographs that could be used for research later. The cockpit revealed the most intriguing clues. The instrument panel was a mixture of standard aviation equipment and custom gauges that suggested the aircraft had been designed for specific performance requirements. A small brass plate mounted below the throttle quadrant bore an inscription that made Joseph's breath catch in his throat. "Violet, Blake, come look at this," he called from the pilot's seat. Both teenagers crowded into the cockpit doorway as Joseph directed his flashlight at the brass plate. Engraved in elegant script were the words, "Built for the stars, grounded by love. CM 1947. Blake repeated thoughtfully, "CM? Those could be the builder's initials." Violet leaned closer to examine the craftsmanship of the engraving. This wasn't just a hobby project. Someone put their heart into building this. Plain. Joseph nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with discovering something that had clearly meant everything to its creator. "We need to find out who CM was and why this aircraft was abandoned." As they prepared to leave the hangar, Joseph's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Stephen Bradley's name, and Joseph's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. Stephen was the manager at Community Bank, and calls from him never brought good news. "Joseph, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Stephen's voice carried the forced friendliness of a man delivering an unwelcome message. "What can I do for you, Stephen?" "I'm afraid I need to schedule a meeting with you about your accounts tomorrow afternoon, if possible. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding your loan status." Joseph closed his eyes, knowing exactly what Stephen wanted to discuss. The shop's account was overdrawn again, and the house payment was now 4 weeks late. "I'll be there at 2 Sadai." When he hung up, both teenagers were watching him with worried expressions. Joseph forced a smile and began gathering his tools, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Just bank business," he said casually. "Nothing we can't handle." But as they drove home in gathering darkness, the weight of financial reality pressed down on Joseph's shoulders like a physical burden. The mysterious aircraft represented hope, but hope didn't pay immediate bills or buy groceries. Unless he could find a way to turn their discovery into quick cash, the Clark family's future remained as uncertain as ever. That evening after the twins had gone to bed, Joseph sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop, beginning the research that might determine whether their discovery was a blessing or simply another beautiful dream that reality wouldn't allow them to keep. His initial searches revealed tantalizingly little about experimental aircraft from 1947 with the initials CM. But as the hours passed and his coffee grew cold, Joseph began to piece together fragments of information that suggested their discovery might be more significant than he had dared to hope. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted his research. Violet appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing pajamas and fuzzy slippers, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Joseph looked at his daughter, seeing Grace's determination in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. "I keep thinking about that aircraft. Something tells me it's important. But I can't shake the feeling that we're running out of time to find out what it really means." Violet leaned over to look at his laptop screen, which displayed a fuzzy photograph of what appeared to be a similar aircraft from an old aviation magazine. "Maybe running out of time is exactly why we found it now. Maybe some things come into our lives exactly when we need them most." Joseph reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand, marveling at the wisdom that sometimes emerged from her 14-year-old perspective. "When did you get so smart?" "I had a good teacher," she replied with a smile that reminded him powerfully of Grace. "Dad, whatever happens with the bank tomorrow, we'll figure it out. We always do." As Joseph looked into his daughter's confident eyes, he felt a surge of determination that had been missing from his life for months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt like the Clark family had something worth fighting for. The meeting at Community Bank left Joseph feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Stephen Bradley had been polite but firm. The Clark family had 30 days to bring their accounts current or face foreclosure proceedings on both the house and the shop. As Joseph walked across the town square toward Prairie Rose Diner, the November wind seemed to cut right through his jacket, matching the chill that had settled in his chest. Rose Sullivan looked up from wiping down tables as the bell above the diner door announced Joseph's arrival. At 62, Rose had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent caring for others, and her eyes immediately recognized the defeated posture of a man carrying more weight than he could bear. "Coffee and pie?" she asked, without preamble, already reaching for the pot. Joseph slumped into his usual booth near the window, where he could see the airport in the distance. "Just coffee. I'm not sure I could keep anything else down right now." Rose poured the steaming liquid into a thick ceramic mug and settled into the seat across from him, her own cup cradled in weathered hands. The diner was empty, except for Walter Watson, the retired Air Force pilot who spent most afternoons nursing a single cup of coffee while reading aviation magazines. "Bank meeting?" Rose asked, with the directness of someone who had watched this town struggle for decades. Joseph nodded, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to problems that seemed insurmountable. 30 days. If I can't come up with $8,000 in 30 days, we lose everything." Rose's expression softened with sympathy, but her voice remained steady. "That's not going to happen. This town doesn't abandon its own, Joseph Clark. We've been through worse." "This is different, Rose. I can't ask people to bail me out of my own failures." From across the diner, Walter Watson's gravelly voice interrupted their conversation. "Did I hear someone mention aviation troubles?" The old pilot approached their table with the careful gait of a man whose knees had accumulated too many years and too many hard landings. Walter had flown everything from crop dusters to military transports during his 40-year career, and his knowledge of aircraft was encyclopedic. "Richard Morrison mentioned you found something interesting out at the airport," Walter continued, settling into the booth beside Rose. "Mind if an old flyboy takes a look?" Joseph found himself describing the mysterious aircraft. from its elegant lines to the cryptic inscription on the brass plate. As he spoke, Walter's expression grew increasingly thoughtful, and when Joseph mentioned the initials CM, the old pilot's eyes widened with recognition. CM, you said, from 1947. Walter leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. Joseph, I think you might have found Charles Mansfield's lost prototype. The name meant nothing to Joseph, but Rose gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The Charles Mansfield? Walter nodded grimly. One of the most brilliant aircraft designers of his generation disappeared in 1947 while testing an experimental aircraft somewhere over the Midwest. They never found him or the plane. Joseph felt his pulse quicken. You're saying this could be the aircraft he was flying when he disappeared? Not the one he was flying, Walter corrected. The one he left behind. Mansfield was working on a series of experimental designs before his disappearance. If what you found matches the descriptions from the old aviation journals, it could be worth a fortune to collectors and museums. Rose's practical nature immediately asserted itself. Worth how much of a fortune? Walter stroked his chin thoughtfully. A genuine Mansfield prototype, properly authenticated, could be anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million, depending on condition and provenance. The numbers hit Joseph like a physical force, momentarily taking his breath away. $8,000 had seemed impossible an hour ago, but now they were discussing sums that could not only save his business, but transform his family's entire future. How would we go about authenticating something like that? Joseph asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. You'd need an expert in vintage aircraft, someone with access to Mansfield's original design documents, Walter replied. Dr. John Mitchell at the Kansas Aviation Museum would be your best bet. He's written extensively about missing aircraft from that era. Joseph's mind was already racing with possibilities, but Rose's next question brought him back to earth with a thud. What happened to Charles Mansfield's family after he disappeared? Walter's expression grew somber. He left behind a young wife, pregnant with their second child, Helen Mansfield. She tried to continue his work for a while, but eventually moved to Chicago and started over. Built quite a business empire from what I hear, but never remarried. I imagine losing her husband that way left deep scars. The weight of this revelation settled over the table like a heavy blanket. They weren't just discussing an abandoned aircraft anymore, but a piece of someone's heartbreak, a remnant of a tragedy that had shattered a young family decades ago. If this really is Charles Mansfield's prototype, Joseph said slowly, then his widow might still be alive. She'd have a claim to it. Rose nodded approvingly. That's the right way to think about it, Joseph. Money's important, but doing right by people is more important. Later that afternoon, Joseph drove back to Hangar 5 with a borrowed digital camera and a notebook, determined to document everything about the aircraft that might help with authentication. The wind had died down, leaving the November air crisp and still, perfect for the detailed photography he needed to undertake. As he worked methodically around the aircraft, taking pictures of every rivet, every surface, every detail that might prove significant, Joseph found himself thinking about Charles Mansfield and the passion that had driven him to create something so beautiful. The craftsmanship was evident in every joint, every curve, every carefully considered design element. The engine compartment revealed custom modifications that spoke of innovative thinking decades ahead of its time. Lightweight components, experimental alloys, and aerodynamic refinements that wouldn't become standard in aviation for another 20 years. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a glimpse into the future, as one brilliant mind had envisioned it in 1947. Joseph was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear footsteps approaching until a familiar voice called out behind him. "Finding anything interesting?" He turned to see Anthony Harrington standing in the hangar doorway, his expensive overcoat and polished shoes looking distinctly out of place in the dusty industrial setting. The developer's presence here was unexpected and unwelcome, like finding a snake in a garden. "Anthony," Joseph said carefully, not moving away from the aircraft, "what brings you to this part of the airport?" Harrington stepped further into the hangar, his cold eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. "Richard Morrison mentioned that you'd found some old junk out here. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about." The dismissive tone in Harrington's voice set Joseph's teeth on edge, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Just an old aircraft that's been stored here for decades. Nothing that would interest you. Actually, everything on this airport property interests me, Joseph. I've made the town council a very generous offer for the entire facility. This hangar and whatever's in it would be part of that deal." Joseph felt ice form in his stomach. "The airport's not for sale?" Harrington smiled, the predatory smile of a man who held all the cards and knew it. "Everything's for sale at the right price. The town needs revenue, and my development project would generate more tax income in 1 year than this little airport has produced in its entire existence." "This airport serves an important function in the community," Joseph said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "There are people here who depend on it for their livelihoods. People like you." Harrington's smile widened. "I heard about your meeting with Stephen Bradley today. 30 days to come up with $8,000, wasn't it? That's unfortunate timing, especially when you're wasting time on worthless antiques instead of focusing on real solutions." The fact that Harrington already knew about the bank meeting confirmed Joseph's suspicions about how information traveled in a small town, especially when money and influence were involved. He set down his camera and stepped closer to the developer, his hands clenched at his sides. "My financial situation is none of your business, Anthony. Actually, it is my business. When you inevitably default on your loans, your shop will go up for auction. I'll be there to make sure it's purchased by someone who understands its real value as commercial real estate." Joseph's vision seemed to narrow to a tunnel focused entirely on Harrington's smug face. "You're not getting my shop or this airport or this aircraft." Harrington laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the cold air. "Joseph, you're a dreamer. That pile of aluminum isn't going to save you. Even if it were worth something, which I doubt, you don't have the resources to restore it or the contacts to sell it. You're going to lose everything anyway, so why not make it easy on yourself?" "Because some things are worth fighting for," Joseph replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Harrington studied Joseph's face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something in the mechanic's expression that hadn't been there during their previous encounters. When he spoke again, his tone carried a subtle threat. "Fighting is expensive, Joseph. Make sure you can afford the cost." After Harrington left, Joseph stood alone in the hangar with the mysterious aircraft, feeling like he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just his family's future, but the future of everything he valued about his community. The developer's visit had made one thing crystal clear. Time was running out, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. But as Joseph looked at the elegant lines of Charles Mansfield's creation, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. This aircraft represented more than just a potential solution to his financial problems. It was a connection to someone who had dared to dream of flying higher and faster than anyone before him. Someone who had poured their heart into creating something beautiful and lasting. If Charles Mansfield could chase impossible dreams in 1947, then maybe Joseph Clark could find a way to save everything that mattered in Hartwell, South Dakota. In the present day, the Kansas Aviation Museum in Wichita buzzed with quiet activity as Dr. John Mitchell examined the high-resolution photographs Joseph had spread across his desk. The historian's office was a treasure trove of aviation memorabilia, with vintage propellers mounted on walls beside framed photographs of legendary aircraft and their pilots. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above stacks of research materials. Dr. Mitchell adjusted his reading glasses and picked up another photograph, studying it with the intensity of a detective examining crucial evidence. At 63, he possessed the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades piecing together aviation mysteries, but Joseph could see excitement building behind his scholarly composure. "These engine modifications are remarkable," Dr. Mitchell murmured, pointing to a detailed shot of the power plant. Mansfield was experimenting with fuel injection systems 20 years before they became standard. And look at these wing root fairings. The aerodynamic efficiency would have been extraordinary for 1947. Joseph leaned forward in his chair, trying to read the expert's expression. "So, you think it's authentic?" Dr. Mitchell set down the photograph and turned to a thick file cabinet behind his desk. After a moment of searching, he withdrew a manila folder marked with faded typewriter labels. Inside were photocopies of technical drawings and handwritten notes, yellowed with age, but still legible. "These are copies of Charles Mansfield's design notes from the family estate," Dr. Mitchell explained, spreading the documents beside Joseph's photographs. His widow donated them to the Smithsonian in 1962, but I obtained copies for my research. The comparison was immediately striking. Details from the photographs matched precisely with elements shown in Mansfield's sketches: the distinctive engine cowling, the unique wing strut configuration, even the placement of inspection panels on the fuselage. Joseph felt his heart rate increase as the evidence mounted. "The serial number would be the final proof," Dr. Mitchell said, consulting a handwritten list. "According to these notes, the prototype should have CM-47,001 engraved somewhere on the main engine mount." Joseph pulled out his phone and scrolled through dozens of photographs until he found the image he was looking for. The engraving was barely visible beneath decades of grime. But the numbers were unmistakable. CM-4701. Dr. Mitchell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that seemed to convey the weight of historical significance. "Joseph, what you found is aviation history. Charles Mansfield was working on designs that wouldn't be fully understood or implemented for decades. This aircraft represents a quantum leap in 1940s technology. What happened to him? Walter Watson mentioned he disappeared while testing an aircraft." Dr. Mitchell's expression grew solemn as he consulted another file. "October 15th, 1947, Mansfield took off from a private airfield in Kansas in a different prototype, one he'd been working on for the military. Weather was deteriorating, but he was determined to complete a high-altitude performance test. Radio contact was lost somewhere over the Colorado Rockies. Neither he nor the aircraft